Before starting, you can join my Patreon for more spicy and uncensored BL stories. Link is in the channel description.
Cress Donahue woke to the sound of a cufflink clicking shut. His eyes stayed closed. His body stayed still. Every muscle in him had gone rigid the second consciousness returned, the way a night animal freezes when headlights sweep across the road. Don't move. Don't breathe. Don't let him know you're awake. The hotel room smelled like him, cedar and gunpowder. A scent Cress had spent 3 years catching across crowded rooms and telling himself he imagined. A scent that meant nothing. A scent that meant everything. A scent that was now fading from the sheets beside him, already cooling, already becoming something Cress would have to learn to live without again. The mattress shifted as weight left it. Turn around. Cress's heart beat once hard against his ribs. Please, just look at me. Just see me. Footsteps crossed the room. Soft, deliberate. A man who didn't need to be quiet but chose to be anyway. The sound of fabric being pulled into place. The whisper of a jacket settling over shoulders. Turn around. The footsteps stopped beside the bed. Cress's fingers curled into the sheets. He kept his breathing even. Kept his face slack. Kept every part of himself performing sleep so perfectly that even his own body almost believed it. There was a pause. 2 seconds. 3. Then the click of a paperweight being lifted. The soft rustle of bills being laid down. The weight settling back into place. Cress's blood turned cold. He had known. From the moment he had let the security chief at the Rinaldi wedding mistake him for an escort, he had known this was a risk. From the moment he had walked into this room instead of correcting the error, he had known. But somewhere beneath the knowing had been a thread of hope so thin it was almost invisible. What if he recognizes me? What if he touches me and realizes? What if the footsteps moved toward the door? For your trouble? 2 words, flat, dismissive. The kind of thing you said to a cab driver, the kind of thing you said to someone you never intended to see again. The door opened, closed, locked from the outside with a soft click. Cress opened his eyes. The room was empty. The sheets beside him were rumpled and cold. On the nightstand sat a stack of bills held down by a brass wolf paperweight. $1,700. The exact price of the Rinaldi floral contract, which Cress had designed and installed and watched wilt from across the ballroom while pretending not to look at the man who had paid for it. He sat up slowly. The sheet pooled at his waist. His skin was still warm. His heart was still beating too fast. And on the pillow beside him, a single white petal lay curled against the fabric, fallen from the boutonniere he had been wearing, from the wedding he had spent 12 hours decorating, from the only thing in this room that had been his. Cress picked up the cash, counted it, set it down. Then he picked up the petal, white protea, fragile, already starting to brown at the edges. He held it between his thumb and forefinger and looked at it for a long time. The room was silent. The city was still dark. The man who had just paid him for a night Cress had given for free was already gone, already moving through a world where Cress Donahue was a transaction, a receipt, a line item in a ledger he would never see. Cress's hand trembled once, then it stopped. He did not cry. That was not the beginning, not really, but it was the last time he didn't know. Silence. Not the silence of an empty room, the silence of a man deciding where to begin. Cress's voice came through the dark, calm and unhurried. The voice of someone who had already lived through the worst of it and was only now finding the words to carry someone else through. But that came later, a pause. First, let me tell you about the night I thought I was beautiful for once and what it cost to be looked at all. The word looked hung in the air. Then the scene shifted. The Delacroix estate at dusk was the kind of beautiful that made Cress forget to breathe. Not the beauty of the building itself, though it was impressive, all warm stone and climbing ivy and windows that caught the sunset like held breath. But the beauty of what he had built around it. Archways of white protea and eucalyptus, cascading down from the terrace like frozen waterfalls, tables draped in cream linen, each centerpiece a careful composition of pale blooms and silver foliage. The air itself seemed softer here, filtered through petals, and the quiet attention of someone who had spent 18 hours making sure every stem was exactly right. Cress stood at the edge of the garden, threading a final spray of waxflower into the main arch. His hands moved without thinking, twisting, tucking, adjusting, the muscle memory of 1,000 arrangements layered into his fingers. He was wearing dark work clothes, practical boots, an apron with dried sap on the pocket. He was invisible. That was intentional. In this world of alphas and power, and the kind of money that bought silence, invisibility was the only safe thing to be. Cress had learned that early. Omegas were either decoration or liability, and neither role came with the luxury of being seen as a person. So he made himself useful instead. He made himself indispensable. He became the person who created beauty for others, who understood flowers the way most people understood breathing, who could turn a warehouse into a cathedral of white blooms before anyone thought to ask how. If you were useful enough, people stopped noticing you were there, and if they didn't notice you were there, they couldn't hurt you. You've been at this for 14 hours. Cress glanced over his shoulder. Sully Marchetti stood in the doorway of the estate's side entrance, hands in his pockets, watching with the patient stillness of a man whose job was to wait. Beta, head of security for the Delacroix organization, former military, the kind of person who noticed everything and said almost nothing. 15, Cress corrected, turning back to the arch. But who's counting? Your back, probably. My back and I have an understanding. Cress tucked the last stem into place and stepped back to examine his work. The arch was perfect. Not because it was flawless, because it looked like it had grown there, like the flowers had decided to arrange themselves into this shape without anyone's help. That was the trick, making something that cost 12 hours of labor look effortless. Sully watched him for a moment longer. Then, boss wants to meet the decor team. Cress's hands paused. Not because he was nervous. He had met plenty of bosses. Mafia weddings were his specialty. The richer the family, the more they spent on flowers, and the less they cared about who arranged them as long as the result was spectacular. Cress had learned to be spectacular on command, but something in Sully's tone made him look up. Which boss? Sully's expression didn't change. The only one that matters. Cress wiped his hands on his apron, took off his work gloves, followed. He did not ask why. The study smelled like old books and brandy, and the particular quiet that came from rooms where decisions were made without witnesses. Cress stood near the door with the rest of the decoration crew, 4 betas, 1 Omega Florist whose name he couldn't remember, all of them pressed against the paneled wall like they were trying to take up as little space as possible. The room knew they were there. The room had already decided they didn't matter. 9 people sat around the central table. Dark suits, expensive watches, the kind of stillness that came from people who had never needed to prove they belonged. Cress cataloged them without meaning to, a habit from years of reading rooms for exits. The woman at the far end with the scarred hands. The man with the wedding band polished to a mirror shine. The younger man in the third chair who kept touching his collar like it was too tight, and then the door opened. The air changed, not dramatically, not the way cheap stories described it, with pressure and dread and the room going cold. It was smaller than that, more precise. The kind of change you felt in your lungs before your brain caught up, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the moment before a storm breaks when the world holds its breath. Evander Voss walked in. He did not look at anyone. That was the first thing Cress noticed. Most powerful men entered a room by scanning it, assessing threats, locating allies, making sure everyone knew they had been seen. Evander did none of that. He walked to the head of the table, stopped, and picked a spot on the far wall. He watched it for 3 full seconds, not assessing, not calculating, waiting. Cress's hands went still at his sides. He had seen Evander before. Of course he had. The man's face was on half the contracts Cress's studio signed, the shell companies that paid his invoices, the briefs that always specified white protea as if the flower itself was a signature. But seeing a name on paper was different from seeing the body it belonged to. Evander was taller than Cress had imagined, broader. His suit was dark and unremarkable, but his hands were not. They were rough, scarred, the hands of someone who had done more than give orders. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. His eyes, when they finally moved from the wall to the room, were the color of winter sky just before snow. They swept across the table, across the people, across the decoration crew pressed against the wall like furniture. They paused. 1 second, 2, Cress's breath locked in his chest. Evander's gaze had landed on him, not on the crew, not on the wall beside him, on him. And in that moment, something flickered behind the alpha's eyes, not recognition, not quite, something more like a question. A thread pulled loose from a pattern he hadn't noticed was there, then it was gone. Evander looked away, sat down, began speaking to the man beside him in a low, even voice. The meeting proceeded. Cress did not hear a word of it. He stood against the wall, heart hammering, telling himself it meant nothing, that powerful people looked at everything, that the pause had been coincidence, that he was imagining the weight of a gaze that had already moved on. His phone buzzed in his pocket, 3 times in quick succession. Ren, a blur of messages about a stray cat, a running joke, the kind of nonsense that only someone who actually cared would send. Cress didn't look at it. He couldn't move his hand. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Evander rose without ceremony and walked toward the door, past the crew, past Cress. His hand touched the doorframe as he passed, just a beat, just a pause, just long enough for Cress to notice the way his fingers curled against the wood. Then he was gone. Cress stood in the study, surrounded by people gathering their things, and told himself it meant nothing. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. Year 1, the Gala Cress's studio received a commission 6 weeks after the Delacroix wedding. A corporate gala, open budget. The client was a shell company registered in the Caymans, which was not unusual. Half of Cress's clients were shells, names that existed only on paper, money that arrived clean and asked no questions. The brief specified white protea for the centerpieces. Cress read that line 3 times. He told himself it was a coincidence. White protea was popular. It meant courage, transformation, the kind of symbolic weight that rich clients loved to pretend they understood. It didn't mean anything. He used them anyway. The gala was held at a converted warehouse downtown. Cress worked through the night to install the arrangements, hanging thousands of pale blooms from the ceiling like a frozen sky. By dawn, the room looked like a dream someone had forgotten to wake from. He did not see Evander that night, but he felt him. Standing on the mezzanine level, adjusting a cascading branch of jasmine, Cress looked up and caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows above. A silhouette. Broad shoulders, the faint glint of a watch catching low light. When he looked again, the silhouette was gone. He told himself he had imagined it. Year 1, the expo 6 months later. A design expo in the city center. Cress had a booth showcasing his studio's work, pressed flower arrangements, preserved installations, the kind of high-end botanical art that made wealthy clients reach for their checkbooks. Evander appeared at the booth next door, not deliberately. Cress watched him walk past, flanked by 2 men he didn't recognize, heading toward an exit. He didn't stop, he didn't look. He was 6 feet away for 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds, Cress forgot how to breathe. Evander's gaze swept the expo floor once, neutral and distant. It passed over Cress's booth without slowing. Cress watched him disappear through the exit doors. He told himself it was better that way. Year 2, the auction, a charity gala for children's health care. Cress's work was featured in the silent auction, a preserved protea arrangement in a shadow box, the blooms sealed in resin, eternal and unmoving. He had spent 3 months on it. The highest bid came in at $40,000. The bidder was anonymous. Cress found out later, through a contact in the auction house, that the winning paddle had been registered to an alias he recognized. The same shell company that had commissioned the gala. The same shell company that had paid for the Delacroix floral expansion. The same shell company that, as far as Cress could tell, existed only to fund his career. He did not confront anyone. He did not ask why. He stood in his studio that night, holding the dried protea from his window, and felt something in his chest crack. Year 3, the restaurant Cress was at a restaurant in the East District, eating alone after a late installation when Evander walked in with Sully. It was a small place. Dim lighting, the kind of restaurant where people went to be unseen. Evander and Sully took a table near the back, and for the first time since Cress had known his name, Evander looked relaxed. He was laughing at something. His head was tilted back, his shoulders were loose. His mouth, that sharp, unsmiling mouth that Cress had only ever seen pressed into a thin line, was curved into something that looked almost gentle. Cress watched him from across the room. He watched the way Evander's hand moved when he talked. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners. The way he leaned forward when Sully spoke, listening like the other man's words mattered. And Cress realized he wanted to be the reason for that laugh. He wanted it so badly it hurt. He paid his bill and left without finishing his food. Year 3, the end of hope. Cress sat in his studio at midnight, 3 weeks after the restaurant, and looked at the dried protea in the window. It was still there, still wilting, still refusing to fall apart completely. I am tired of hoping for a man who only shows up in flowers I can't trace. He set the protea down. He picked up his phone. Bram Castellan had been patient for 2 years. Kind, present. He asked Cress about his day and meant it. He remembered the names of Cress's plants. He showed up when he said he would. He was safe. Cress typed a message, dinner tomorrow. I'm free. Bram's reply came within seconds. I know a place. Pick you up at 7. Cress set the phone down and looked at the protea. He did not throw it away. He should have. The night Cress Donahue let Evander Voss believe he was someone else, he wore his best shirt. Not because he thought it mattered. Because if he was going to do this, if he was going to let himself be seen by the man who had spent 3 years refusing to see him, he wanted to look like someone worth remembering. The Rinaldi wedding had ended at midnight. Cress had stayed to break down the installations, working alone in the empty ballroom while the last guests filtered out. He was tired. He was lonely. He was running on 3 hours of sleep and the kind of quiet desperation that felt like a fever. When the security chief found him in the hallway and said, Mr. Voss requested company for the evening, Cress did not correct him. He should have. He should have said, I'm the florist. I'm not on the list. You've made a mistake. Instead, he said, which room? He told himself it was curiosity. An experiment, a chance to see if Evander would recognize him when he wasn't hidden behind an arrangement of white protea. He knew it was a lie. The hotel room was dim when Cress entered. Evander was sitting in an armchair by the window, reading something on his phone. He looked up when the door opened. His gaze swept over Cress, once neutral, uncurious, and then returned to the screen. You're early. Cress's heart was hammering so hard he was sure Evander could hear it. Traffic was light. Evander made a sound of acknowledgement. Set the phone aside. Rose from the chair with the fluid economy of movement that Cress had watched from across 100 rooms. He was beautiful, Cress realized. Not in the way men were supposed to be beautiful, not polished or soft or easy to look at. He was beautiful the way a blade was beautiful, functional, dangerous, shaped by use. Evander crossed the room toward him. Light, he said again, and Cress didn't know if he meant the traffic or something else. Then Evander reached out and touched his face. Cress's entire body locked. Not from fear, from the shock of being touched by someone who had only ever existed at a distance. Evander's hand was warm against his jaw, calloused, deliberate, and Cress leaned into it before he could stop himself. Evander's eyes flickered, not recognition, something else, something like the thread he had pulled loose at the Delacroix estate, tugging now at the edge of his awareness. What's your name? The question hung between them. Cress could have told him. Could have ended it right there. Could have said, Cress Donahue, I designed the Rinaldi wedding. You've been funding my career for 3 years. Do you remember me now? Instead, he said, whatever you want it to be. Evander's thumb traced across his cheekbone. That's dangerous, he said softly. Giving someone that much power. Cress looked at him. I know. They did not turn on the lights. Cress asked for that, a small mercy, a way to keep the distance intact. In the dark, he could pretend he was anyone. In the dark, Evander couldn't see the hope cracking through his chest. Evander agreed without asking why. And in the dark, Cress let himself be touched by a man who did not know him, who had never known him, who was paying for a service Cress was giving for free. If I leave before he wakes, this can be a story I tell myself. He memorized every detail. The weight of Evander's hand on his wrist, the sound of his breathing when he fell asleep. The way his brow smoothed out in rest, unguarded, almost young, Cress lay awake beside him for hours, watching. Remembering, when Evander's grip loosened in sleep, Cress slipped out of the bed. He dressed in silence. He picked up his boutonniere from the nightstand, the white protea he had worn to the Rinaldi wedding, crushed now, petals loose. A single white petal fell onto the pillow. Cress left it there. He was at the door when Evander stirred. Thank you, came the voice from the dark, thick with sleep. For your trouble. Cress's hand froze on the handle. Then he opened the door and walked out. He did not look back. The cash came after. That was the part Cress hadn't expected, the $1,700, the wolf paperweight, the final confirmation that Evander Voss had no idea who he was, that the night had been a transaction, that Cress had given him everything and received nothing but a receipt. He sat in his studio the next morning, staring at the dried protea in the window, and wondered if it was possible to die from hope. The answer, he learned, was no. You just kept living. The restaurant was called Layla's. Small, warm, the kind of place that felt like a secret. Bram had chosen it because Cress had mentioned once 6 months earlier that he liked the way the light fell through the window at sunset. Cress didn't remember saying it. Bram did. That was the thing about Bram. He remembered everything, not in a way that felt like surveillance, in a way that felt like attention. He cataloged Cress's preferences the way other people cataloged their own, unconsciously, automatically, as if Cress's happiness was simply part of his mental landscape. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for him. It was also, Cress would later realize, the first thread of a net. The proposal came with the dessert course. Nothing dramatic. No violins, no flash mob, no down on one knee in a crowded room. Bram simply reached across the table when the plates were cleared, took Cress's hand and placed a small velvet box in his palm. "I know we said we'd wait another year," Bram said quietly. His voice was steady, but his hand trembled slightly where it rested over Cress's. "But I've known since the first dinner, and I don't see the point in waiting when I already know." Cress opened the box. The ring was modest, a single diamond set in rose gold, not flashy, not ostentatious, the kind of ring that said, "I know you" instead of "I want to impress you." The restaurant was playing a song Cress had mentioned once. He looked up at Bram, at his kind eyes, his patient smile, his steady hands, and felt something in his chest crack open, not from joy, but from relief. Here is someone who will stay. Here is someone who will not leave cash on the nightstand. "Yes," Bram's face broke into a smile so genuine it made Cress's heart ache. "Yes, absolutely yes." Bram leaned across the table and kissed him, soft, sweet, the kind of kiss that promised safety. Cress closed his eyes and tried to believe it. Outside, in the street, a car sat idling. Evander Voss gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. He had found out about the proposal through a contact in Bram's firm. Had driven to the restaurant without deciding to. Had sat in the dark for 40 minutes, watching through the window as Cress smiled and laughed and said yes to someone else. He did not get out of the car. He did not go inside. He watched until the dessert plates were cleared and the bill was paid, and Cress walked out on Bram's arm, radiant and unsuspecting. Then he put the car in drive and disappeared into the night. He did not know why he had come. He did not know why he stayed. Back at the table, Cress paused at the door. Something pulled at the edge of his awareness, a flicker of wrongness he couldn't name. He looked toward the street, toward the row of parked cars, toward the shadows where a dark sedan had just pulled away. Nothing, just the night, just the city, just the life he was choosing. "Everything okay?" Bram asked, his hand warm on Cress's lower back. Cress turned away from the street. "Everything's fine." He told himself it was true. The wedding was in 2 weeks. Cress was in his studio at midnight, surrounded by fabric swatches and ribbon samples and the particular chaos of a man trying to make his own wedding beautiful while also finishing 4 other commissions. The floor was covered in petals. His coffee had gone cold 3 hours ago. His phone was buzzing with messages from Ren that he hadn't opened. He was happy, or he was telling himself he was happy. The line between the two had blurred recently, somewhere between the engagement announcement and the guest list, and the dress fitting that made him feel like he was dressing up for a role he hadn't auditioned for. He pushed the thought away. The invoices. He needed to organize the invoices for his accountant. The quarterly filing was due in a week, and if there was one thing Cress had learned in the Mafia wedding business, it was that the tax authorities were the only force more terrifying than organized crime. He pulled the file from his cabinet. 3 years of payments, dozens of clients, shell companies with names that blurred together after the first hour of sorting. He was halfway through the stack when he found it, a payment history, 3 years long, total $480,000. The client was listed as Protea Holdings Limited. Cress stared at the name. His mind moved very fast and very slow at the same time. He was connecting dots that had been there all along, the anonymous commissions, the Protea specifications, the jobs that appeared exactly when his bank account dipped below comfortable. The gala, the auction, the Delacroix expansion, every major contract of the last 3 years, all from the same shell company, all from the same invisible patron. No, he flipped through the pages. The payment records were meticulous, each one stamped with a date and a reference number. The first payment had arrived 2 weeks after the Delacroix wedding. The last one had been processed 6 days ago. 6 days ago. While Cress was choosing centerpieces for his wedding to another man, no, he checked the incorporation documents, the registered address, the signatory name, Evander Voss, Cress laughed. It came out of him like a broken sound, wet and sharp, cracking through the silence of the studio. He laughed until his ribs ached and his eyes burned and his hands were shaking so badly he had to set the papers down. 3 years. 3 years of success, of growth, of building a career he thought he had earned on his own merit, and none of it was his. Every contract, every opportunity, every moment he had stood in a room full of powerful people and thought, I belong here, it had all been arranged, paid for, orchestrated by a man who had rejected him in person while funding him in secret. Why? The question burned through the laughter, through the shock, through the cold settling in his chest. Why give me everything except yourself? He sat in the wreckage of his studio, surrounded by invoices that proved his success was a gift he never asked for, and tried to find an answer in the silence. The protea in the window watched him, wilting, eternal. It had no answers either. He didn't confront Evander. He didn't call Bram. He sat there until the sun came up, and then he packed the invoices back into the file, closed the cabinet, and went home to the man who was supposed to be his future. The wedding was in 13 days. Cress had no idea what he was going to do. The morning of Cress Donahue's wedding was clear and cold. He stood in front of the mirror in his studio, the same studio where he had built a career he now knew he didn't earn, and looked at the man in the white suit. The flowers in his lapel were white protea. He had chosen them without thinking. Now he looked at them and felt nothing. You could still run. The thought came quiet, clinical, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this moment 100 times. You could walk out the door, get in your car, drive until the protea stops growing. But where would he go? Every road he traveled had been paved with Evander's money. Every door that opened had done so because Evander paid the price of entry. Even the flowers pinned to his chest were a signature, a claiming he had never consented to but could not undo. Bram would be waiting at the altar. Kind Bram, patient Bram, the man who had never once looked at him like a transaction. Bram deserves better than a man who is marrying him because he's safe. Cress closed his eyes. Then he pinned the protea firmly into place and walked out the door. The venue was a restored greenhouse in the hills. Cress had chosen it himself, a cathedral of glass and iron, filled with ferns and climbing roses and the particular green light that only came through old windows. It was beautiful. It was exactly what he had dreamed of. He walked down the aisle flanked by Ren, his beta friend, who was crying before they even reached the altar. Bram was waiting at the end, radiant in a simple gray suit, his eyes fixed on Cress like he was the only person in the world. Cress smiled. His heart did not stop screaming. In the back row, almost invisible in the shadow of a pillar, Evander Voss sat motionless. He had not been invited, he had not been expected, but some arrangements required no permission to exist. Sully stood behind him, silent and watchful. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. They were here for one reason, and that reason was walking toward another man with a smile on his face and protea in his lapel. Evander watched. He did not blink. He watched the way Cress's hand trembled slightly when Bram took it. He watched the way Cress's gaze flickered just once toward the back of the room, toward the shadows, toward him. Their eyes met. 1 second, 2, Cress's smile did not waver, but something in his expression shifted, a crack so fine only Evander could see it. I know. Evander felt the message like a blade between his ribs. I know what you did, and I'm marrying him anyway. The officiant said the words. The rings were exchanged. The kiss was given. Evander sat in the dark and watched the man he had spent 3 years loving from a distance marry someone else. He did not move. He did not leave. He stayed until the ceremony ended and the guests filed out and the greenhouse stood empty, echoing with the ghost of a wedding that had just become someone else's memory. Then he rose, adjusted his jacket, and walked out into the cold. He had things to arrange. He had always been good at arranging things. Cress would learn that soon enough. The cottage was on the coast. Cress had chosen it because the walls were white and the windows faced the sea, and there was nothing in the entire rental that reminded him of flowers. No dried arrangements, no botanical prints, just salt air and peeling paint and the sound of waves that had been breaking against the same rocks for 1,000 years. He thought distance would fix him. He had been wrong. The first 3 days were good, or good enough. Bram was attentive in the way that made Cress's chest ache, making coffee in the morning, wrapping a blanket around Cress's shoulders when the wind picked up, pressing soft kisses to his temple as they watched the sunset from the porch. This should be enough. Cress repeated it like a mantra. This should be enough. This is enough. This is the life I chose. But at night, when Bram's breathing evened out into sleep, Cress lay awake and stared at the ceiling. His mind kept circling back to the same image, Evander's face in the shadows of the greenhouse, the sharp line of his jaw, the stillness of his hands. Why did he come? Why did he watch? Why did he pay for everything I have and then refuse to take anything but that one night? He had no answers. He only had questions that multiplied in the dark like a living thing feeding on his silence. On the fourth night, Bram noticed. They were lying in bed, the window cracked open to let in the sound of the sea. Bram's hand was on Cress's chest, tracing absent patterns over his heart. The motion was soothing, automatic, the kind of intimacy that came from months of shared space. "You're not here," Bram said quietly. Cress's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "Exactly what I said." Bram's hand stilled. "You're in this bed, you're in this cottage, but you're not here. You've been somewhere else since the wedding, maybe longer." Cress opened his mouth to deny it. He closed it again. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the waves. "I want to help," Bram said. His voice was gentle, but there was something underneath it, a thread of weariness that Cress hadn't heard before. "But I can't help someone who won't tell me what's wrong." "I don't know how." Cress wanted to say it. He wanted to open his mouth and let the whole truth spill out, the invoices, the patronage, the night in the hotel, the hope he had carried for 3 years like a stone in his chest. But the words wouldn't come. It had been years since anyone had given him permission to speak. He had forgotten how. "Give me time," Cress said finally. "I just need time to adjust." Bram looked at him for a long moment, then he nodded slowly and pulled Cress closer. "Okay," he said, "I'll wait." The kindness in his voice was worse than anger would have been. Cress closed his eyes and listened to the waves. He did not sleep. The last night of the honeymoon, Cress stood alone at the water's edge. The moon was full, painting the sea in silver. He had his phone in his hand, open to a number he had never saved but had memorized anyway. Evander's number. He had found it in the Protea Holdings files. He stared at the screen for a long time. What would I even say? Why did you give me everything? Why did you let me go? Why did you come to my wedding and watch me marry someone else? There was no message that could hold all the questions, no text that could bridge the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. Cress closed the phone. He walked back to the cottage. Bram was asleep, his face peaceful in the moonlight. Cress lay down beside him and stared at the ceiling until dawn. They had been back from the honeymoon for exactly 1 week when the first package arrived. Cress found it on the doorstep of his studio, wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with twine. No return address, no note, just a box that felt like it contained something fragile. He opened it with his heart already racing. Inside, a single preserved protea bloom sealed in a glass dome. It was perfect, eternal. The petals were a deep, impossible white, the color of moonlight on snow. Cress turned the dome over in his hands. There was a serial number engraved on the base. He checked it against the Protea Holdings invoice records. Lot 417. The bloom from the night at the hotel, the one he had crushed, the one he had left on the pillow. Evander had kept it. Evander had preserved it. Evander was sending it back to him now, 3 years later, with no explanation and no context and no way to pretend it meant nothing. Cress set the dome down on his work table. He stared at it for a full minute. Then he called Sully. Sully met him at a cafe 2 blocks from the studio. He looked unsurprised to see Cress, which meant he had known the call was coming. "I need to talk to him." Sully took a long sip of his coffee. "He figured you'd say that. And he said to tell you no." Cress's hands tightened around his cup. "I'm not asking permission. You're not in a position to demand anything either." Sully's voice was calm, but there was no cruelty in it, only fact. "He's protected, you're not. If he doesn't want to see you, you won't see him." "Then why send the flower?" Sully was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said. "That's not my question to answer." "Then give me his number." "I can't. Give me his address." "I can't do that either." Cress leaned forward. "Then tell me one thing." Sully waited. "Why did he fund my career?" Sully set down his coffee. For a long moment he didn't speak. When he did, his voice was lower, quieter, stripped of its professional distance. "You want to know what I think?" "Yes. I think he's been in love with you since the first time he saw you arrange flowers at the Delacroix wedding. I think he's too broken to do anything about it. And I think he's been trying to buy you a life he didn't think he could be part of." The words landed like stones. Cress couldn't breathe. "Now," Sully said, standing and pulling out his wallet, "if you'll excuse me, I have a boss who doesn't like being discussed behind his back." He put cash on the table, enough to cover both their drinks and a generous tip. He'll come to you, Sully said, pausing at the door. When he's ready, not before. Then he was gone. Cress sat alone in the cafe, the preserved protea burning in his memory, and waited for a man who had always moved at his own pace. He had been waiting for 3 years. He could wait a little longer. That night, Bram noticed the glass dome on the work table. New commission, he asked. Cress felt the live form in his throat. He swallowed it. Something like that. Bram nodded, accepting, trusting. Cress watched him walk away and felt the distance between them widen into something that might never be bridged. Bram found the second package before Cress could hide it. It had arrived that morning. Another brown box, another preserved bloom, this one from the gala Cress had designed 2 years ago. The protea was suspended in resin, a perfect frozen moment with the serial number matching the invoice from that night. Cress had left it on the kitchen counter by mistake. He walked in from the studio to find Bram standing at the breakfast bar, the resin block in his hands, his face unreadable. "What is this?" Cress's mouth went dry. "It's a preservation piece, a client's work." "A client?" Bram turned the block over, examining the serial number. "This number matches the Protea Holdings invoices, doesn't it? The ones you've been getting for 3 years. Cress said nothing. Bram set the block down carefully like it was fragile. When he looked up, his eyes were not angry, they were tired. So tired that Cress felt his heart crack open. "I've been patient," Bram said quietly. "I've given you space. I've trusted that you would tell me when you were ready, but I can't keep living with a man who's halfway in love with someone else." The words hit like a physical blow. "Bram, don't." Bram held up a hand. "I'm not accusing you of anything you haven't already told me with your silence. You leave your phone face down. You flinch when I touch you from behind. You've been waiting for something since the honeymoon, and I don't think it's me." Cress wanted to deny it. He couldn't. "I was hoping you would choose me," Bram continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I thought if I was patient enough, kind enough, you would eventually look at me the way you look at whatever it is you're waiting for." "Cress, I love you." The words hung in the air between them. "I love you too," Cress said, and he meant it. He did. But even as he said it, he felt the shape of the words hollow, incomplete, reaching for something that wasn't there. Bram heard it too. "I know," he said softly, "but not enough." The kitchen was silent. "I'm not going to give you an ultimatum," Bram said after a long moment. "I'm not going to tell you to choose. Because that would mean I'm competing for something I should already have." He picked up his keys. "I'm going to stay at my brother's for a few days. Use that time to figure out what you actually want. And if it's me, really me, not just the safe option, then come find me." He paused at the door. "But if it's him?" Bram shook his head. "Then let me go properly. Don't keep me as a placeholder while you wait for someone else to be ready." The door clicked shut. Cress stood alone in the kitchen, the resin block glowing in the afternoon light, and felt the life he had built crumbling around him. He didn't go after Bram. He stood there until the sun set, and then he picked up the phone and dialed the number he had never saved but had memorized. It rang, once, twice, 3 times, then a voice low and familiar. "You shouldn't have this number." "I know." A pause. "Why did you send the flowers?" The silence stretched so long Cress thought Evander had hung up. "Because I wanted you to know," Evander said finally, "that I never forgot." Another pause. "Even when I should have." The line went dead. Cress held the phone to his ear for a long time, listening to the silence, and felt something shift inside him, a door opening, a path revealing itself, a choice he could no longer avoid. He was standing in the wreckage of his marriage, and for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't afraid of what came next. The warehouse was in the industrial district, a converted factory that Evander Voss used as a secondary office. Cress had found the address through the Protea Holdings Shell Company registration. It had taken him 3 days of searching, 3 days of Bram's silence, 3 days of staring at the preserved blooms on his work table. He didn't call ahead. He didn't warn anyone. He simply showed up at midnight with the invoice file under his arm and a cold fury burning in his chest that had been building for 3 years. The door was unlocked. Cress walked in. The warehouse was half empty, filled with shipping crates and filing cabinets, and the particular sterile smell of wealth kept a distance. At the far end, under a single bare bulb, Evander sat at a metal desk, reading something on a tablet. He looked up when the door opened. He didn't look surprised. "Cress, don't." Cress crossed the floor in a few long strides. He dropped the invoice file on the desk, the full Protea Holdings file, all $480,000, every transaction documented. "Don't say my name like you have the right to." Evander set the tablet down slowly. His eyes moved to the file, but he didn't open it. He already knew what it contained. How did you find the address? That's what you're leading with, Cress's voice cracked. I find out that you've been funding my entire career for 3 years, that every success I've had, every contract I earned, every moment I thought I was building something on my own was actually you, paying for me, buying me, like I was a commission you didn't have to look at. Evander's jaw tightened. It wasn't like that. Then what was it? Cress slammed his hand on the desk. Explain it to me, because I've been trying for 3 days to find a version of this story where you're not a manipulative bastard who couldn't decide whether to keep me or throw me away, and I'm coming up empty. The silence was sharp enough to cut. Evander stood. He was taller than Cress remembered, broader, closer. The space between them shrank to nothing. You want the truth? Evander's voice was low, raw, stripped of every layer of control Cress had ever seen him wear. Yes. The night of the Delacroix wedding, I didn't buy you because I wanted to own you. I bought you because I wanted to keep you. Because I walked into that ballroom and saw you standing in the middle of 300 flowers, and you looked like the only real thing in the room. Cress's breath caught. And I knew, Evander continued, stepping closer, that I was too broken to be part of your life. That I would ruin you if I stayed, that the only way to protect you was to make sure you had everything you needed from a distance. So you paid for everything. Yes, and you never told me, no, and you came to my wedding. Evander's eyes flickered. Yes. Why? Evander was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, because I wanted to see if you looked happy. Cress felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Did I? No, Evander's gaze held his. You looked like a man who had chosen safety over truth, and I couldn't blame you, because I had spent 3 years making sure you never had to choose anything else. The warehouse was silent. Cress stood in front of the man who had given him everything except the one thing he had actually wanted, and realized he had been given a choice he never knew he had. So what now? Cress asked. Evander looked at him, at the invoices, at the preserved blooms on his desk, at the man standing in front of him with 3 years of questions in his eyes. That depends, Evander said slowly, on what you want. Cress looked at the file. He looked at Evander. He looked at the door behind him where a kind man was waiting for an answer he didn't deserve to keep waiting for. I don't know yet, Cress said honestly. Evander nodded. Then take your time. For the first time in 3 years, it felt like the truth. Cress walked out into the night. The door closed behind him. Inside, Evander sat down at his desk and opened the invoice file. He read every page. And then he picked up the phone and made a call that would change everything. 3 days after Cress threw the invoices on Evander's desk, Bram came back to the apartment to pack his things. Cress had known he was coming. Bram had texted ahead, I'm coming by for my clothes. You don't have to be there. Cress had read the message 5 times, trying to find the right response, and eventually settled on, I'll be here. He owed Bram that much. The door opened at noon. Bram looked tired. Not angry, Cress had been bracing for anger, would have welcomed it, would have known how to meet it, but simply tired. The kind of exhaustion that came from loving someone who couldn't love you back the right way. I'll be quick, Bram said. He didn't meet Cress's eyes. Take your time. Bram walked past him into the bedroom. Cress heard the closet door open, the rustle of hangers, the methodical sound of a man dismantling a shared life. He stood in the living room and didn't know what to do with his hands. 20 minutes later, Bram emerged with 2 suitcases and a garment bag. That's everything, he said. His voice was steady. I left the books we bought together. You can keep them or donate them, your choice. Bram, I'm not angry. Bram finally looked at him. His eyes were red-rimmed but dry. I want you to know that. I'm not angry, I'm just sad. Cress felt the word lodge in his chest. I never meant to hurt you. I know, Bram smiled, small and sad. That's what makes it worse. You didn't mean to. You just did it anyway because you were too busy being in love with someone else to notice. Cress opened his mouth, closed it. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't make it worse. Bram picked up his suitcases, paused at the door. I meant what I said, Cress. I love you. I think I will for a long time. He took a breath. But I can't be your second choice. I can't be the person you settle for because the person you really want isn't available. You were never my second choice. Bram's smile was sadder now. Yes, I was. From the moment you said yes to my proposal, you were waiting for someone else to show up. I just didn't want to see it. The silence stretched. Take care of yourself, Cress. Bram opened the door, walked through, closed it behind him. Cress stood in the empty apartment, surrounded by the books Bram had left behind, and listened to the sound of footsteps fading down the hall. He didn't cry. He wasn't sure he had the right to. An hour later, he texted Evander. Bram left. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, I know, I'm sorry. Cress stared at the screen. Don't be. He deserved better than what I could give him. Another long pause. Then, so do you. The words landed like a door opening. Cress sat in the silence of the apartment, phone in hand, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of a future that didn't require him to be small. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't know where it would lead. But for the first time in a long time, he wanted to find out. The next morning, Cress walked into his studio, picked up the glass dome with the preserved protea, and set it in the window facing the street. Let Evander see, let him know. Cress was done hiding. He was ready for whatever came next.